Hello, everyone. I'm going to start the webinar now. Thank you for joining today's Resilient Connecticut webinar to hear about new precipitation projections for the state that are based on a recently released Connecticut climate report. We're also hearing about work being done in the city of New Haven to address flooding and some new strategies they have to monitor precipitation and storm surge at the local level. I'm Katie Lund, Circa's Director of Engagement. I'm going to be moderating this hour-long webinar, which is part of a series that Circa is hosting along with partners on a variety of adaptation and resilience topics relevant to the state. Before we start, just a few mechanics to mention. The webinar is being recorded and we'll post it online following the event. You all have your audio muted, but you can use the chat box in the bottom portion of your screen to ask questions. If your chat box is not open, then you can just simply click on the icon. It looks like a conversation bubble in the lower middle part of your screen. And then just simply type in your question and click enter so I can see it as the webinar moderator. We'll try and save the last 10 minutes or so for questions and answer. I'll do my best to track your questions throughout the webinar and facilitate responses with our speakers. So today we're fortunate to have two presenters, including Guiling Wang, a professor at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and also in the Institute of the Environment. She'll be highlighting elements of this new Connecticut climate report that will start the webinar. A note regarding this report that we actually also have Dr. Angie Seth on the line from University of Connecticut's Department of Geography. She's the lead author for this new report being featured, and while she's not presenting today, Dr. Seth was instrumental in leading a team of diverse UConn faculty through a Circa research grant. We're also very fortunate to hear today from Dawn Henning, who is the project manager in New Haven's engineering department. She will be describing some of the ways the city is addressing and monitoring their local precipitation events and flooding issues. So I'll begin by turning it over to Professor Wang, and her slides are up on the screen, and she can begin. Thank you, Guiling.
Thanks, Kitty. Hi, everyone. So I am going to present the projections for future precipitation changes in Connecticut, and these are results from the climate assessment report that was led by Dr. Angie Seth. The report has both temperature assessment and precipitation assessment. Today, I'll just focus on precipitation. So for those of you who have followed the climate assessment in the international level and also here in the U.S., most of those assessments are done basically for the at a very coarse resolution, and for the national assessment, we, the Northeast, is treated as an entity. That doesn't really serve us well in terms of developing adaptation strategies at the state level, at the local level. So that's where we came in to look at the spatially distributed assessment for Connecticut. And also, most of the climate projections are done by global climate models that has a very coarse resolution. Connecticut is probably, even smaller than one grid cell in those models, which again doesn't give us the spatial variability that is needed for adaptation effort. And what we are using in these assessments is a statistically downscaled climate data set that is based on those global model results, but add spatial features, and eventually it gave us a product that is at the daily resolution and also at a spatial resolution of 4 kilometers. We're going to define climate change based on 30-year averages, and also some indices are extremes. But the 30-year that we're using as historical reference are 1970 to 1999. And for the future, we are looking at both the mid-century and late century. Again, each of those corresponds to 30 years. And when also these data set that we are using, it has data for 20 global models. However, here our assessment is based on 8 of them. Those 8 are chosen based on the genealogy of the model, who development, where it was developed and whether it shared code with some other models, because we don't want to give any group of model more weight than what the uniqueness of the model. And also we look at the performance of those models in our region, as well as how sensitive that model is, both based on the global climate sensitivity and also regional sensitivity, which means for the northeast part. Those 8 models include 2 from the U.S., 1 each from Canada, UK, France, Australia, China, and Russia. I'm sure you all know that the climate change is primarily driven by CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. Therefore, projecting the future climate will have to be based on what a future CO2 concentration will look like, which then depend on emissions. And that emission, of course, is a function of technology and also economical development, as well as policy to reduce emission. In this assessment, we are based on the RCP 8.5 scenario, which correspond to these high emission scenarios. And the rationale for this choice is that when we look at what happened in the past few years, both in terms of the emission and in terms of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we have been tracking the RCP 8.5 scenario. RCP stands for representative concentration pathways. Which is this yellow line here, and you can see, where we are right now. We are tracking that line. Of course, if the emission is reduced in the future, it will reduce the magnitude of the changes that we will be looking at. So talking about the impact of climate change, typically the warming on water resources, on precipitation, theoretically, there are these 2 points that I would like to emphasize. One is that in a warming world, the evapotranspiration process will be accelerated, which is basically loss of water from the ground to the atmosphere. And when you have that evapotranspiration process accelerated, then it's going to exacerbate aridity, which therefore increases drought risk. And the other aspect is that warmer air holds more moisture, and that is going to lead to more intense precipitation and more extremes. Therefore, it means greater flood risk for us. So that theory has been there for decades, and the data has recently come in because for precipitation, it has a very large natural variability, so it takes a long time to show the trend. And observationally, by now we have seen that there has been more intense and more heavy precipitation event, and at the national scale, unfortunately, Northeast is leading the way towards greater frequency and greater intensity of heavy precip. And as you can see from here as well, that assessment at the national level, it treats the Northeast as an entity which goes from over here all the way up to Maine, and that doesn't help us at the state level a lot in terms of looking at what specifically we might need to do to adapt to these changes in the precipitation regime. In addition to increase of the heavy precipitation, the precipitation amount itself also has been observed to go up. Here we are looking at this spatially distributed map that is based on the data set that we are using for this assessment. What I'm showing here is the trend defined as changes per decade. For example, if we look at the annual precipitation in the upper left corner, when we see a 1.6 over here, for example, that means per decade we have seen a 1.6 inch of increase in annual total precipitation. The other variables showing here are different indicators of precipitation extremes and heavy precipitation. As you can see that throughout most of the Northeast, it has been increasing. And where you see that black hatching, that means even though, for example, in Connecticut here, even though it has been increasing, however, the magnitude of the increase or the trend is still fairly small by now, and we're going to look at how it will be in the future. So first of all, look at the total precipitation. And what we are looking at here is in the upper left panel is the annual total precip averaged over just Connecticut. And we can, the green shading shows the range of the simulation and the projections from the 8 models. So some models give you a low number, some models give you a high number, but if you look at the low and the high for all these 8 models, that's what we are looking at. And this black line is what has been observed. So the model are consistent with the observation in terms of showing that, okay, annual precipitation has been increasing in the past 3 or 4 decades. And when we look at the future changes, it continues to increase. And here in this panel, we are looking at the mid-century changes and the late-century changes. And these changes are defined based on the difference between mid-century and the reference period, which is 1970 to 1990. And we all of these changes are statistically significant. And most of the increase is projected for winter and spring, as you can see here. In the over here, I have the breakdown for those changes of total precipitation among the 4 seasons. And you can see that in terms of the magnitude and also in terms of the model consensus, the winter and the spring really stand out. When I say model consensus, if you look at, for example, summer for late century, most of Connecticut has a blank there. What that means is that the 8 models that we looked at, they do not agree. They are splitting either 4 to 4 or 5 to 3 in terms of whether the precipitation will increase or decrease. And in the for the fall season, for example, there are shaded area there. However, there are black hatchings. That means the changes are so small that we cannot, it doesn't pass the significance test. So most of the changes, the increase of the precipitation is expected for winter and spring, and that's not when the highest water demand is. And in summer, when we do need water, the increase is either small or by late century, the models cannot even agree whether we are going to have more or less rainfall. And even though you might have an increase of precipitation, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have more water. And speaking from the agriculture perspective, more water means we are looking at the difference between precipitation and what is lost through evaporation. And we have seen from the theoretical point that with high temperature, we expect more evaporation. And therefore, when we look at the water availability, we look at the difference between precipitation and the potential evaporation. So potentially how much water could be lost to evaporation. If we look at that, then the future changes are actually negative. At the annual scale, if we look at the annual total, then by mid-century, we are not quite sure yet because the model don't agree with each other. And by late century, we are looking at less water available. And the summer is more the lack of water or the projected decrease of water availability is more severe, and primarily because evaporation is primarily taking place in the warm season, and it is the fastest in the summer. So despite a projected increase of precipitation, we are actually looking at a decrease of potential water availability, especially in the summer. And now looking back at the observations, if we look at past observations, the data said, it has been actually increasing, even though that increasing trend is very small. The model actually agrees with the observation. If you look at these average over Connecticut for the annual potential water availability and for the summer quantity as well, the observation and the model in the past 4 decades shows a slight increasing trend. And looking into the future, however, the model is telling us that eventually it is going to change direction and change towards a decrease of water availability. And in this particular case, this past observed trend is not indicative of the future changes yet. And we also looked at, if there would be less water available, how do we sort of define the changes in potential drought, right? Here we are looking at the future retain period for the previously 1 in 20 years drought. So if a drought that was happening in every 20 years statistically, then in the future, that trend, the retain period is going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 years by mid-century, and it's going to be about 5 years by late century. So that is the drought aspect, and now I'm going to switch gear towards looking at heavy precipitation, which is the cause for flood. And I'm showing here quite a few variables that every one of them indicate a different aspect of heavy precipitation. The first one is the so-called simple intensity index. Basically, on average, when it rains, how heavy it rains. And you can see that there is a continued trend of increase in the future. And the second panel is the number of days within a year that has more than 1 inch of rain. Again, that continues to increase into the future. And that is consistent with the past trend. And the third here N99 is the number of days with heavy precipitation. Heavy precipitation, we define it as precipitation that is basically higher than 99th percentile. And then F99 is a fraction of the annual total precipitation that is accounted for by those heavy events. Again, it continues to increase in the future, continue that trend that has been observed in the past 3 decades. And the R1D and R5D is the annual maximum 1D precipitation and the annual maximum 5D precipitation. So these two are more relevant to flooding. For smaller watershed, typically the R1D, the maximum 1D precipitation, is the most relevant. For very large watershed, the 5D precipitation is more relevant. And this is showing that the model projects an increase of both variables. And I'm going to, in the next, zoom in to look at the R1D, using R1D, the 1D maximum precipitation as an example to look at the spatial pattern of it. And here we're looking at the projected changes of that R1D. The top row shows the 30-year average. Recall that we define climate based on 30 years. And for the historical period, this value is approximately, on average, is approximately somewhere between 2.6 to 3, and in the future we are looking at by mid-century an increase of 0.7 over here and more than 0.8 over there. These are all in units of inch of precipitation on a single day. And late century, it actually has a smaller increase than mid-century, but both of these increases are statistically significant, meaning that we are pretty sure that it is an increase. And the lower row shows the 1 in 20-year extreme 1-day precipitation, which means historically this heavy 1-day event was happening at approximately 1 every 20 years statistically. And in the future, that 1 in 20-year event, the magnitude of the future 1 in 20-year event is projected to increase significantly. And you can see that here we are looking at 3 inch of increase for a single day precipitation. And similarly, when you look at the late century, the increase is smaller, and also there are regions where the model do not agree whether there is going to be an increase or decrease. I'm going to talk about that later in terms of why there will be this difference between mid and late century. So here we are looking at this new or future recurrence interval or return period of those previously 1 in 20-year events and also previously 1 in 100-year events for that maximum 1-day precipitation. So we can see that in the upper row that is for the 1 in 20 years. In the future, by mid-century and by late century, the return period will be basically less than 10 years. And again, you see these uncertainty areas in the late century. For the 1 in 100-year event, in the future, it's going to be less than every 50 years. And the area where the models cannot agree becomes larger than the 1 in 20-year events. So in terms of why that projected changes for the late century are even smaller than for the mid-century, there are a few factors that influence that. One is there are decadal variability, and also the most important thing is that when we look into the future, we are looking at the larger uncertainties further into the future, and also larger uncertainties for rarer events. The rarer the events are, the more uncertainty we'll be looking at. And another reason is that when we use the statistical downscaling approach to downscale this global model to fine resolution, there is an underlying observational data that we sort of go back to refer to. Those are the data that is used to train this downscaling approach, and it is having a hard time in dealing with precipitation events that start to appear in late century that had no historical analog at all. Therefore, what we learned about history can no longer work in the future. So to summarize, in terms of the annual precipitation, we are looking at significant increase for the mid and late century, approximately 8% increase by mid-century and 10% by late century, and with the most of the increase projected for winter and spring seasons. However, accompanying that is a significant decrease of potential water availability, especially during summer, which suggests significantly higher drought risk. And we've seen significant increases from the model in the average precipitation intensity and also in the heavy precipitation events, and a significant increase in both the intensity of the extreme precipitation and also in the frequency of these previously rare extreme events, suggesting significantly higher flood risk. Yeah, those are what I have to say today for the projections of precipitation in Connecticut.
Thank you, Guiling. A reminder to everyone on the line that if you do have questions, that you can enter them using the chat bubble on your screen, and I'll monitor them. We don't have any related to your presentation just yet, Guiling, but so we'll save time at the end for people that have questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Don Henning now to give a presentation regarding this case study in New Haven. While Don is getting her slides up, the report that Guiling was just providing the precipitation summary about is on our CIRCA website. It was just released this fall. And to all the participants on the webinar, in addition to the recording of the webinar, I'll send out a link to that report, which, as Guiling said at the start of her talk, that report is more than just about precipitation. It also has projections and historical look using these models for temperature too, downscaled to Connecticut. So we'll be sending that out to all the participants. But Don's slides are now on the screen. So Don, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll hear a little bit about how New Haven is addressing some of these concerns.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Guiling, for that great presentation. I think I'm going to be showing a firsthand experience of what you have predicted and shown will be happening in Connecticut and what's already happening now. So this will be showing the challenge of managing urban runoff in light of this increased frequency of high-intensity rainfall, and how we're trying to utilize real-time data to address the issue. So we had a newsworthy event just this past month. Just a quick 1-hour storm dumped about an inch of rain on New Haven, causing significant flooding and disruptions in the heart of downtown. And these types of storm events and the resulting flooding have been occurring more and more frequently. and impact areas that are critical to the city's functioning. So the downtown drainage area is our largest sewer shed at about a little over 800 acres. It's about 76% impervious, and it contains much of our downtown, the residential, some of the residential area of the Hill neighborhood. The hospital is over here, a lot of the hospital properties, Long Wharf, which has a lot of commercial properties, the Railyard on the northeast corridor, a really important transportation corridor. I-95 is here. And then Route 34, or the Oak Street Connector, was like an unfinished highway that was constructed in the 50s that I'll talk a little bit more about. But you can see highlighted here are frequent flooding areas in that hatched orange color. And so this area was originally a combined sewer area, and since about the 70s, it has been separated in some areas, so we've put storm pipes in the streets. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that all of the properties that were connected to the combined sewer have been separated, so it's still kind of a combined and partially separated sewer shed. And while it shows 2 regulators, only one, regulator 25, is currently active. And then there are only 2 outfalls, the north and south outfalls, that carry all the flow from this 800 acres out towards the harbor. So a little bit of history of New Haven. I just think this is really important for understanding some of why we have the problems we have. You can see this is a map from the early 20th century. You can see where our shoreline was, and this dotted line shows where it currently is. And so a lot of our drainage area is extremely low-lying. And as a result of development, when they were building that Oak Street connector, it was excavated, and that fill was used to make what is now Long Wharf, in addition to the construction of 95. And so a lot of this area is really low, even when you're like a mile or so away from the harbor. Just to kind of put that in more perspective, so if you have a higher high tide at about 4 NAVD 88, Brewery Street over here right behind IKEA and where the post office is only not even a couple of feet higher than that in elevation, and then right in front of the Railyard on Union Ave and right where our police station is, and also at some points in Route 34, you're only at elevation just under 9 feet. And so you don't have a lot of headroom to play with in order to get the flows out to the harbor. And so as we experience higher sea level and storm surge, it's getting more and more difficult for us to drain our downtown area. This little graphic kind of highlights this problem, and because we only have those 2 outfalls, the Railyard is kind of serving as like a choke point for the system, and so this entire about 600-acre area is trying to drain through these 2 outfall pipes. One is 4x6, 2 4x6 box culverts and a 66-inch pipe. And it's very difficult now to construct, as you can imagine, additional pipes underneath the Railyard and through to the harbor. And so this is kind of defines our problem. And the more sea level rises and that we experience storm surge with these high intensity events, the more flooding we seem to be experiencing. And so this diagram shows between 2010 and 2015, New Haven experienced a number of storms that were 5, 10, 25-year return frequencies. And I think Guiling's research shows that these return periods are actually decreasing. And so at the time, we were like, is this normal? Is this something we have to plan for? You know, as a municipality, you're experiencing things, but you don't always, have that research or know what you should be planning for. And so, but we knew what we were experiencing, which is significant flooding and a lot of intense rainfall. And so I just wanted to show some examples of what this looked like. So 2014, we have a 5-year, 1-hour storm. Again, it's these high-intensity, short-duration rainfall that really seems to impact our system. And so this is the the police station right across from the train station. This is in the Railyard properties behind IKEA, that area. Significant flooding for a relatively short storm. Again, in April 2017, we had the peak of the storm coincide with an unusually higher than predicted high tide, and it wasn't even a one-year return event, and we find flooding like this in front of, again, our train station, similar areas, but when you have to operate a city, flooding in front of a major train station like Union Station is really not okay. And a year later, here are some of the same, it kind of looks like I took pictures from the same event, but this is a year later, almost to date, similar issues occurring. And so the city has undergone a number of studies to try to understand this problem and then also come up with solutions. What are we going to do? And so these studies have created stormwater management models where you can calibrate them. You input data on your landfall and your land use, physical infrastructure, and tides, and they model the complex dynamics going on between them, and you can try to use them to evaluate potential solutions. So this is kind of a diagram from an earlier study, and this is from one of our later studies, adding more and more detail to try to decrease the uncertainty with these models. And so just to go over some of the proposed solutions, from the first study was to build a lot of large pipes in the area, including jacking 4 72-inch pipes underneath the rail yard and having 2 10-foot by 6-foot box culverts that are 2,500 feet long out to the harbor. Very significant construction that would take, and even with all of this new pipes, because it was thought to work under gravity and not be pumped, it would only work under limited tidal conditions, and so it was assumed that eventually you'd have to build a pump station to pump this out to the harbor. So then there was another study that built off that looked at utilizing some existing infrastructure that was underutilized. So in red here is a large stormwater pipe outfall that was constructed as part of the sewer separation work, but then the rest of the area that was meant to drain to this pipe has not yet been separated. So it's a pipe that exists that's not being, that doesn't have a lot of flow in it. And so the thought was, could we build a pump station in that Route 34 corridor that could pump to this pipe that was already existing, and maybe minimize the cost and the construction disruption that we'd have to do. The problem with this one was that it didn't really resolve the Union Ave flooding, although it did help a lot with the Temple Street and Route 34 flooding. So around this same time, 2013, the city was installing some of its first right-of-way green infrastructure projects. New Haven is blessed with being built on very sandy soils, and so green infrastructure is a really great tool for the city to not only deal with the water once it's in the sewer system, but can we remove some of that water before it gets into the system itself. And we've also updated our zoning ordinance in 2012 to require that new and major redevelopment projects will also capture stormwater, retain the first inch of runoff on their site. So trying to utilize green infrastructure. And also between 2010 and 2014, storms Irene and Sandy hit. And so the combination of that led the city to realize that it needed to take a green and a gray infrastructure approach. I mean, the benefit of green infrastructure is it's something you can do more immediately while you try to figure out and plan for that gray infrastructure and then raise the investment that you're going to need, the resources, in order to construct that type of project. And so thanks to generous funding from the Connecticut Department of Housing, the CDBG disaster recovery funds that were made available after Sandy for Sandy recovery. We received money to continue to study this problem and also to install green infrastructure, which we are actually still doing to date. So we're in the process of constructing 175 right-of-way bioswales throughout the upper portion of the drainage area, again, to try to remove some of that water so that we have less to deal with by the time it gets to the Railyard and gets out to the harbor. And we continue to study this issue, but the latest modeling led us to, again, a pump station, although we were kind of trying to avoid that need, but a much smaller pipe out to the harbor, a 6-foot pipe micro-tunneled underneath the Railyard, and 200 CFS pump station as a first phase in addressing the problem. It still wouldn't resolve all of the flooding, so there was a phase 2 that would look at storage options. And so we continue to study this because we don't necessarily want to build all of that storage, and we look into, I'll get into a little bit more detail, but how much can green infrastructure handle will be a big question that we need to answer in order to optimize our solution. And one of the challenges with the past study that we had done was that, of course, after all of that rainfall, the second we installed monitors to capture data that we would use to calibrate our model, it stopped raining. So like Guiling was talking about, it's like we get these intense periods of rain and then we have drought. And of course, we experienced that during the few-month period where we had paid a lot of money to put these monitors in the ground. So one of the shortcomings of this short-term monitoring system is that you pay per week per monitor, and even if you don't get rain. And so we paid, a significant amount of money, and we didn't get anything more than anything up to a 1-year storm frequency. And so in order to have high confidence in the model, we want to capture rain events that represent the types that we're seeing that cause the flooding in our area. Whoops, wrong way. So that led us to applying for a CIRCA grant, because we thought, well, what if we just had our own monitors, and if we installed them and we can start to capture long-term data. And then we can, if we strategically install a series of just level sensors and flow sensors, and also some water level sensors in our green infrastructure, we believe that the combination of this data could give us more confidence in our model and give us more understanding, a greater understanding of these complex dynamics that we're experiencing in our system. So we've installed some of these ADS Echo monitor level sensor monitors. They're really great because they don't require you to go all the way into the system. You can install them with a bar at the top of the manhole. And we're not only thinking to use this data, for long-term planning, but also we can use it immediately to respond to flood events that we continue to experience. So this is an example of the output from this model. It can show us when the pipe is surcharging, and also it has a pressure sensor in it, so it could tell us the depth of the flooding above the manhole when that happens. And so I've highlighted where we experience flooding. And I went out to field verify if it was actually telling the truth, and unfortunately it was. There was about 10 inches of rain on our streets. You can't even see the curb. It's over the curb, and now the street and the IKEA parking lot look like one. And so it is working. And, prior to having these monitors, we would just get in the car and go look at our frequent flooding locations and try, and see what's happening. But with this monitor, it will send us an alert when, the pipe's surcharged, or when it's beyond ground level, and so we can respond more strategically. We can call up our emergency response and have them block the roads if needed. So it's really a great tool while we try to solve this problem for responding to flood events. In addition, we're also, with one of our partners at the Yale School of Forestry, we're trying to quantify the impact of installing all of this green infrastructure in our downtown. And so we've installed flow meters in, there's a major pipe that runs down Elm Street, and there's another one that runs down Chapel Street. And so we've installed them, and before we looked at the impact of green infrastructure by looking at the flow in the sewer before green infrastructure was installed and after. And although these results are very preliminary, we're finding significant decreases in runoff due to these installations. He's saying up to 75% reduction in runoff for the events that he's captured. And so that is a big deal. We're not wholly surprised because we've seen infiltration rates of our soils be in the hundreds of inches per hour, and so we do believe that New Haven's green infrastructure has the potential to perform more significantly than maybe some of the research from other cities is showing green infrastructure to perform, and this really could significantly impact the gray solution that we're going to have to incorporate. And so I think kind of in closing, there's really no easy solution to our flooding issues. And add to that, there's this moving target of like, what's the sea level rise going to be and what precipitation trends should we be planning for. It's going to take a green and a gray approach, but we believe that the more data we can have and the greater understanding we can have of our system, we can refine the model and therefore our solution and have more certainty in our solution, because it's going to take a lot of resources to address. And so if we can minimize the gray by implementing the green, we can have a lot of cost savings, a lot of savings in the construction time, and so that is where I am going to leave it for now and see if anyone has questions. And this is a way to get in contact with us as well.
Thanks, Dawn. It was really good to hear the benefits of some of what you're seeing from the monitoring in terms of like the installation of these green infrastructure approaches. And I'm sure the listeners appreciate the fact that a combined approach is something that New Haven is thinking about more in the future. So yes, just a reminder that this is now our time for questions, if you have them for both Dawn or Guiling. And you can, again, enter your questions using that chat bubble that's in the lower middle section of your screen. There is a couple questions here for you, Dawn, I think, to start, and there's also one that's come in for Guiling as well. But what do you think are the lifespan of these monitors that the city has purchased? And in terms of using them, it sounds like you're having to go out in the field a little less. So how much time is it saving from that perspective of needing to go out in the field that you had been doing before?
Okay, so in terms of lifespan, that is a great question. I think that we've worked with professors that have been using these, and I haven't heard that they've ever, unless they lost one physically, that any of these monitors are not working for them, and they've been using them for, I don't know how many years, but years. And so I'm hoping that they'll last us, quite a while. Yeah. I'm thinking WPCA had told us maybe some of their meters lasted about 8 years, but they have the sewer system, so maybe the sewage was a little more destructive. I will keep you posted, but I think given that they are up at the top of the manhole, especially those level sensors, they're not getting inundated all the time. I expect them to last a while. What was the second part of that question? Sorry.
Oh, how much time?
Oh, time
do you
is
feel like
saved, right.
having these
So,
monitors is saving you from having to go into the field as much?
so these are newly installed, so I can't say too much to that yet, except there is some resources you have to pour into actually setting up the system. So right now I think there's maybe a little bit additional time getting the system set up, but I mean, I expect a lot of time savings and just greater efficiency in response from not having to go and physically drive around to all of these sites to find out if it's flooding or not. That's not what you want. You don't want to be driving a car into these things. So I expect that in the long run there would be a lot of time saved, but I don't have it quantified.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that not just time saved in terms of going into the field, but the efficiency with which you would be addressing the problems and being able to target the resources more effectively.
And one of our, and we are still in the process of developing it, is to have a dashboard that we could also share with emergency response and, DPW and other departments that would be interested in this, in having this data readily available. So we have a weather station on top of our building, and to put these level and flow sensors, to have everything all on one screen, so that when these events do occur, everyone that needs to know can find that information very easily.
Yeah. Okay, so switching to a question for Guiling. Based on your research, how often would you suggest revisiting and updating the results of your work in this reporting? And is that updating the same for both the precipitation and the temperature results? Maybe you can't speak to the temperature, but see if you can address that.
So I think we should try to update this according to what is available from, for example, the IPCC CMIP 6 is coming out, and then if or when the downscaled data is available, we should go back and relook at this, primarily because the downscaling approach is also being improved right now. And of course, we are not sure whether those groups who produce the past data will continue to do that. If they, I would be very surprised if they don't. So I sort of look forward to come back to this topic when those new data becomes available.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I know
those will be every 5 years or so.
Yeah, okay. That's similar to the recommendation that's been made in terms of Circa's research on sea level rise as well, is to revisit it at least every 10 years, but thinking every 5 would be more appropriate based on new emissions and projections for sea level rise being on that same similar time scale. Another question, Don, has come in for you. Are you looking at the issue of groundwater inundation and sea level rise as you consider increasing installations of green infrastructure?
That is a good question. So far, we have not. Our soils tend to drain the water quite quickly, that we don't find a lot of ponding of the water. One student researcher was, so the bioswales are 5 feet deep and had a well in there and was trying to get grab samples during a rain event and couldn't even get any because it infiltrates so quickly. But I think, I don't think we're at the point where we're too concerned that we're putting too much water that will raise the groundwater table significantly, where we have to worry about it, especially because we're putting it in the upper portions of the sewer shed, which are at higher elevations than what I expect sea level rise to impact the groundwater. So not yet, but.
Yeah. No, that was a good question. Another one regarding the New Haven approach, I guess. Are you, after hearing Guiling's presentation, concerned about the one-day precipitation events more than you were before, or some of the seasonality aspects in the winter and spring?
Yes. Well, So we found that it's not really the one-day long rainfall that gives us problems. It's really the intensity. So this idea that there's going to be more intense rainfall is alarming. The seasonality also is not great because it sounds like we're going to get more rain in the winter and spring when the ground is frozen and or saturated, and therefore we get more runoff. So that is also not good to hear. I'd be curious as to taking Guiling's research and translating that into like a design storm, or, you know, what kind of return frequencies should we be planning for? You know, there's a lot I could dive into, and I'm curious if that, similar to the way Circa has taken sea level rise projections and said, this is what you should plan for, I would love to see kind of a similar thing done for rainfall events.
I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Oh, that's great.
Well, that's one of the benefits of having webinars like this, is that we try to pair some of the academic kind of research, you know, with some real needs at a municipal level. You know, so for those of you that are actually on the line, if you have other examples or case studies that you think would be helpful to feature on future webinars, please be in touch, because these don't have to be just focused on Circa-funded projects, although these both were through Circa Research Grant and a Municipal Resilience Planning Grant as well. So we're very open to featuring other examples and case studies, I think, in the future. So we are getting close to the top of the hour. I don't see any additional questions. Yeah, I want to be sure and take just a couple minutes for a few announcements, but before doing that, I want to give a warm thank you to our presenters for both your time and sharing your expertise today. It was really valuable to have your presentations as part of our series here. Before closing, the couple reminders, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar so you can share that with others that you don't think were able to attend today, but who might be interested. Our next Resilient Connecticut webinar is going to be held in late October, probably the 22nd or 31st, but it's going to feature speakers who will discuss their local approaches to forming municipal resilience committees. And information about that webinar will go out in the October 1st Resilience Roundup, so that'll be going out next week, and you can register for that one. Circa is also going to be hosting a full-day Resilient Connecticut Summit at Fairfield University on November 12th. Information about that event is already on our website, the Resilient Connecticut website, and it will be sent in the Resilience Roundup newsletter as well. We're fortunate to have Connecticut DEEP Commissioner Katie Dykes provide a welcome and provide highlight some of the recent things that came out of the Executive Order 3 related to climate adaptation. And we also are very fortunate to have a keynote address by Sean O'Rourke as part of that day, who is Rhode Island's Chief Resiliency Officer, and he's going to talk about some of the innovative things that our neighboring state is doing. The afternoon of the summit is going to have breakout sessions, one of which is actually going to feature and focus on some of the aspects of integrated flood risk planning, and that obviously overlaps the topic of today's webinar. So we hope you can attend this event on November 12th. So just wanted to mention that information is on our website along with the registration. So in closing, thanks both, Dawn, to you and Guiling for all of your time and help with today. I know you've provided some really useful information for people to begin thinking about and incorporating into their planning moving into the future here. And appreciation for all of you for continuing to join these webinars and for joining us today. So I'll close there. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.